Hello, my name is Leslie Veronica. Although these videos are primarily designed to aid my students to complete their A-level course, I'm aware that they might be shared with other students or seen by other students, so I just want to introduce myself. I am a lecturer, history and politics lecturer at Belfast Metropolitan College, and the purpose of this series of videos, is really to aid the completion of A-level history, Partition of Ireland. What I will do today is just do a very brief introduction of what you need to know for the Partition of Ireland, talk a little bit about the exam very, very briefly. And then this video will be followed up by a series of videos which will just do a quick overview of each of the major topics. It's very difficult for students, particularly at the minute with school suspended, and a bit of uncertainty about what is going to replace the traditional A-level exams in June. So from that point of view, any help that can be given, I think, is something that everybody wants to do. So this is my contribution to helping all of my own A-level history students and anybody else who wishes to access this, to try to get through the end of the course and to have the same level of capability that they were working towards earlier in the year while still in school. Okay, so the unit that we have been doing and that we do traditionally is the Partition of Ireland, and that is a time frame that runs from 1900 to 1925. The exam is quite a lengthy exam. It's a 2.5 hour exam, and for some of you who are entitled to extra time, then that is going to go on well beyond that. So it's very, very important with a long exam like that you are really very confident about your material before you go in. And also that you're confident about the different styles of question that you're going to tackle. The majority of questions on this paper are source-based questions, so there will be 3 discrete areas, if you like. So you'll get an area or a topic area, and then 2 source questions following from that at the start of the paper. Then you will have another historical area from that era, from that module, and you will have a source question to do with that. Now with the source questions, there's no choices. So you have to know how to address those particular source questions, and in a later video I'll go over some tips as to how you do the various types of source questions. And then the very final section, there is an option. You do have an option there, and that's the essay style question. And by this time at A-level, most students are confident with the essays, although it is worth doing a bit of a review of how you make your essay evaluative and make sure it's analytical, because at A2, that's really where you're going to lose marks, is if you are repeating factual knowledge. If you're given back content but there's no evaluation, then you're going to fall way down those levels. So you need to make it evaluative from the very get-go. It makes it easier for you as well, I think, if you can structure your answer in a sort of a yes-no format, or look at what the proposition in the question is and lay out all the arguments that would support that proposition and then switch that over, and it gives you a format to deal with as well. So essentially, in 2.5 hours, you're going to have quite lengthy questions. They're going to be based around key parts of the specification. The building blocks for all of you is to have the content really tight. Now, I think where students go wrong as well with history is they think that if they've got the content, if they understand what the content is, that's it. But the content's really only the building blocks. You've got to then have the techniques of how you apply that on top of that. So but to go into an exam without being all over that content, without knowing firmly what the main events, who the main people were in each of the specific topics, would really be leaving yourself wide open for something that would not be a good outcome at all. So in terms of the topics, and it's nice to be able to break it up into subheadings, if you like, as you work your way through, because it makes it much more manageable from the point of view of revision, and it's a good technique before you then move on in your academic journey and go to university. So the first section is really the period from the start of the time period for this unit, from 1900 up to about 1910. All right, so 1900 to 1910, what's happening? What are the key issues? What's going on? how do we end up where we do later on in the era? Now, it's very easy with any period of history to keep going back and back and back. And even when you're talking about that period, 1900 to 1910, as I'm sure all of your teachers have done, you will refer back. You'll refer back to what was happening in the 19th century. You'll refer back to, the importance of home rule and the land issue with regards to the growth of nationalism. You'll refer back to big events in the 19th century. But it's equally important to realise that the exam paper is going to focus on 1900 up to 1925. So although you might dip back, maybe even talk about the Act of Union, where the Act of Union came from and how that gives rise, eventually this term unionist, as somebody who supports the maintenance of the Act of Union. Even though you do that, that is background knowledge for you. Really, everything that you need for the exam is going to come in for the later periods. So the 1900 to 1910 period, you're really looking at the development of unionism and nationalism. There are other big events happening at that time in Ireland, which do tend to get sidelined by the nature of the specification. So, for example, one of the biggest things that was happening at the time is the growth of the trade union movement, the growth of labour politics. We don't spend time looking at that. The other thing is the growth of the suffragette movement. I mean, if we'd have been in Belfast or Dublin in 1911, 1910, 1909, they would have been big issues, and they would have been bigger for many people than what was to come later. But again, this sort of unionist, nationalist, tribal style politics was to push that to the side. Your first really major topic is the Home Rule crisis and Ulster resistance to Home Rule. And that is a very important topic. And I feel it's well worth, certainly my own teaching, I spend a bit longer on that topic than on others because there's a lot to it. And everything that you do after that comes out of that crisis. And a lot of the different groups that you're going to have to talk about, you will have met in that period. Some of the big figures of this era you will have met by studying that topic. So it's very important to be really clear about the Home Rule crisis, to be really clear about what happened constitutionally, what was going on in Westminster that had that impact and that carried back to maybe exacerbate some of those issues that come out of the Home Rule crisis. What were the Conservatives doing? Were they just worried about the Empire? Were they just very loyal to Ulster? Were they just trying to get back into power? I mean, they're the sort of questions you want to be asking and thinking about. So Home Rule is your first really, really big topic. And with all of your topics, what do you need to do? You need to go through your textbook. If you don't have a textbook, there's a number of really good ones. There's Russell Rees, there's even FA Science, which is an older one that I used when I was doing my level, still very reliable. Your class notes, you want to go through your class notes. You want to make sure you have the chronology, you have the timeline down, you know what happened and when. And then you break that up into themes. All right, then you think about what's happening politically. What does this group want? What do all the various groups want? What's their leadership like? Why is that group getting more and this group isn't? Because really that's what you're going to end up looking at. So whenever you end up with your final notes, you want to have sort of thematic notes. Draw attention to key individuals, be able to talk about their contribution to that particular set of events, be aware what the outcomes were, be aware what caused those outcomes. Your next big topic is the impact of war and the Easter Rising. Likewise again, same thing, have a timeline, have an idea about what all the various key actors were doing, be aware of who maybe should have done something differently, what was going on at this time, how did this come about, and be very aware with the Easter Rising in particular of the consequences. Because often with the Easter Rising, it's less what happened in that week of the Rising. It's much more about how things emerged after the Rising and what impact that had. After the Easter Rising then, 1916 to 1918, you're building up to this Sinn Féin victory in the general election of 1918. Now, again, this is an interesting topic because it sort of mops up a bit of a sort of a topic that slides in there in the 1914 to 18 category, which is the decline of the IPP, sometimes also framed in essay questions as, John Redmond's political career was a failure type thing. And really, when we're looking at the rise of Sinn Féin, we do need to go back to some of those decisions. I mean, we have to think about, was the start of the downfall of the IPP around the time that Redmond accepted the county option? You know, can we say it was 1914, this is when this starts? The Wooden Bridge speech at the time, that didn't seem particularly controversial. There was a group of people who didn't like it, a much more radical element within the IVF, for example. But I mean, it didn't seem terribly controversial at the time. So, you know, we can trace the decline of the IPP with the benefit of hindsight further back. But we can also say that there were specific events that happened post 1916 that really benefited that. And so, in terms of working out what the factors are, you need to identify key factors. You need to identify, if you like, what the IPP did wrong, what Sinn Féin did right, what role circumstance plays in that, and then specific events. And I think the two big events are really the conscription crisis and the British reaction to the Rising. For many years, certainly when I was doing A levels, I think the focus was on the British reaction to the Rising. I would say now that's moved more towards the conscription crisis, and there's good reason for that, not least the fact that Sinn Féin gained respectability at that time, which they didn't quite have before that. Following on from that, in the Anglo-Irish War or the War of Independence, what you're looking at there, again, there's new key individuals are emerging, right? The Easter Rising leaders, remember, had been executed for the most part. So now you've got new figures coming in. You've got different groups to look at. You've got a whole different approach. You've got to think about politically and militarily what's going on with these two sides in this war. What's going on? Who's winning? Why? Why did that happen? So again, it's about getting the timeline down, about understanding and being across all those facts and figures, understanding how nasty that becomes in 1920, what implications that has, and then finally having some sort of reasoned and evaluative response to what gave rise to the truce, and to what extent the truce suited both sides very well at that time. Next topic is the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And the Anglo-Irish Treaty is, I think, a lovely topic. It comes between these two sort of much more militarily motivated topics of the Anglo-Irish War and then the Irish Civil War. And the Anglo-Irish Treaty then is something very concrete. You're looking at what, you know, both sides, the British and the Irish delegation, wanted. You're looking at what the outcome was. You're thinking about why that outcome came about. And again, focusing on key individuals and getting your timeline down right from the start. That then leads you to the Irish Civil War. And really the Irish Civil War focuses on the idea of, you know, to what extent were the Free State forces always going to come out victorious? To what extent did those who were opposed to the treaty, excuse me, really not have a chance from the start? And you are going to trace what are the arguments, you know, those who are rejecting the treaty, why are they rejecting the treaty, what specifically do they not? And you need to be really tight on that as well, and not fall into that temptation to talk about things, for example, partition, and say, well, you know, they didn't like partition. Well, they didn't like partition, but that's not really what the Civil War was fought about. So looking at the Civil War and think about what was happening, you know, where was the Civil War fought? Where was it really located? And what impact it had on ordinary people's lives as well. And again, thinking about key individuals. And the big losses that come out of the Civil War, the big losses in general with Ireland, the reaction of the Free State forces, for example, the sort of emergency powers that were brought in, all of those interesting things that come out of that. The very last topic you do is the formation of Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland is essentially formed by the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which was, of course, brought in the middle of the Anglo-Irish War. So you start with that and do a bit of the Government of Ireland Act and talk about what the real purpose of that was, and then take that forward, look at 1921, and then talk about the early problems facing this new Northern Ireland government. And really those problems centre around, you know, and reflect what's going on in the rest of Ireland. They centre around security. There are problems with identity. There's definitely economic problems. There's problems with education. So those are the areas that you focus on. But remember, the course stops in 1925. So you're really only looking at the bedding down of this new political entity at that stage. So, as I said before, I think the key thing is to be aware that for every topic area, you want to be clear about the narrative, but that's not how you want to approach your questions. But you need to have that as your baseline. You then, I would advise you to do a good timeline. Get a timeline done for each of those main events. Then add into that timeline who your key individuals are.